To CrossTalk Legacies in the Middle East, I'm joined by my guest, Joshua Landis in Norman. He is the director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. In New York, we have Andy Martin. He is an independent foreign policy and intelligence analyst. And in London, we cross to Charlie Wolf. He is a writer, broadcaster, and political commentator. All right, gentlemen, CrossTalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Joshua, if I go to you first in Norman, Oklahoma. It was 95 years ago the maps were drawn. What's the legacy, the most important legacy in your mind 95 years later?
Well, I think that we are seeing the birth of nations in the Middle East, and dictators like Saddam Hussein, Assad, are little bits of the Ottoman Empire, and they've kept this multi-ethnic, multi-religious parts of the Ottoman Empire together by oppression, largely. Now, in this age of popular movements, we are seeing them challenged. And we're getting the breakup, I think, and rearrangement of ethnic power. And in Iraq, we've had the Shiites come to the top, the Sunnis cast down. In Lebanon, something similar is going on with the Christians losing power, Muslims coming up. And in Syria, the Alawites, small minority, 12%, are challenged. This is much like the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Eastern Europe after the First World War. The map there was completely rearranged. Yugoslavia, 7 countries. Czechoslovakia split in 2. Polish borders changed. In the 2 years after Second World War, 1945 to 47, about 12 million Germans were ethnically cleansed from countries from Poland right down to Ukraine and so forth. So we see massive rearrangement of peoples in order to organize them in national entities.
Josh, I
in these
disagree with you
multi-ethnic,
completely.
multi-religious lands. And I think something similar is going on.
Okay. The crosstalk has already started. Andy, go ahead. Andy, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah. I completely disagree with you. My earpiece fell out.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, we got you.
You see, you're not giving adequate attention to the impact of the United Nations. And I think the best example of the counter-argument is what happened in Kuwait in 1990 when Saddam Hussein did try to rearrange the border with Saudi Arabia and eliminate Kuwait. And President Bush was able to assemble a worldwide coalition because forcible border changes don't work anymore. And we're not going to have ethnic cleansing of millions of people. And at the end of the day, when all this upheaval is over, I seriously doubt that any national borders will change. The only place where I perceive some instability,
it looks like a lot of these countries are already challenged. Andy, if I could stay with you, a lot of these countries are challenged in terms of sovereignty, and we can talk about every single one of them. We don't have a lot of time, but Libya comes to mind, Iraq comes to mind. Charlie, let's go to you, my third guest on the program here, Charlie in London. The legacy here is that we see these lines, these borders were drawn by Westerners, and we're seeing today that those lines are not appropriate to what's happening on the ground, and we can talk about civil society, social movements, and democracy. Go ahead, Charlie in London.
Well, I think I need to concur with the last person to speak. Forgive me, I lost track there.
Okay, Andy.
But who is going to do it? We don't, with Andy, I don't see the United States is maybe the only one physically capable, but I don't see them in the position of wanting to do it, especially under the current administration. And I think even a future, dare I say, Republican administration probably wouldn't be interested either. My older, wiser, more sagacious brother has a saying that it's carried me through life, which is, it is what it is. Was it right to set up these boundaries back
let me give you an example, Charlie, that proves the
rightly
point.
or wrongly, it happened and it's there.
Okay, Joshua, if I can go to you, I'm glad we have a lot of discussion here. But Joshua, I mean, this sounds very Orientalist to me. I mean, these borders are artificial. They don't reflect what's going down in the ground. Go ahead, Joshua. Jump in.
It's not so much the borders. There are borders. Of course, Kurdistan and the Kurdish regions, I think, are developing to an independent nation. But this is the power of nationalism. We've seen Anatolia, Turkey, today was 20% Christian, 1914, 18%. By 1922, after the Turkish Revolution, less than 1% Christian. Iraq, half of the Christians have been ethnically cleansed, the Sabians, other minority groups. And the people have been rearranged, Kurds, Shiites. Palestine, Palestinians largely moved out of Palestine as Jews became a majority, went from being a minority to a majority. And the Palestinians are still losing every day. There's rearrangement. And the borders, of course, are changing too. And I don't think there's going to be a two-state solution. Yeah. There will probably be a one-state solution of some kind. And Lebanon, we've seen the Christians lose out.
I still disagree with you.
Christians are leaving the Middle East.
Okay. Andy, jump in New York.
This is
go
rearranging.
Ahead. Go ahead, Andy.
Populations.
Andy, go ahead.
First of all, Kurdistan is a place where there is sort of a potential nation when you take parts of Syria and Turkey and Iraq. But there is absolutely no prospect of the United Nations or the world community recognizing a nation there. And if the Kurds, who are doing rather well as a part of this old empire construct, were to declare their independence from Iraq, they would find zero recognition from the United States, from the United Kingdom, from France, from the European Union. So we're dealing with a very different world. And of course, the Israelis also disprove your point. The Israelis would love to annex the West Bank and create what they call Eretz Israel, but they are prevented from doing so by the knowledge that that would probably ostracize the Israeli regime. So changing borders by force or annexation, I don't think is an option, and I think the United Nations
What's really interesting here, gentlemen, is we have we're looking at it in two different ways. We're looking at international law and the United Nations, which is all nice and fine. But Charlie, facts on the ground are very different, okay? The Kurds are not going to listen to that. If they have a chance for their nation state, they're going to go for it. Iraq is being broken up into 3 different countries. Libya is falling apart as well. It doesn't matter if the international community recognizes this separation. They're happening on the ground as we speak. Go ahead, Charlie.
Oh, yes. Right. And I think also facts on the ground also are there from historic reasons. For instance, Israel actually was supposed to be far larger than it is. Transjordan was part of Mandate Israel. Again, that's not how it turned out. I don't think the Eretz Yisrael argument holds as much water as people say. I think the Israelis are only interested essentially in their security. You know, I'm sure there are some that would love to expand out to what was once supposed to be theirs, but again, it is what it is, and Israel is what Israel is. I think they're more worried about what's happening on their borders. Syria is more of a concern, and I think
it's
also
very interesting is that we talk about recognition of states under the United Nations, but then a country like Israel doesn't have to follow international law. That's hypocrisy. That's an exception. I don't want to make this whole program on Israel. I want to talk about the legacy of the Ottoman Empire. Go ahead, Joshua.
Libya is, you know, we don't know how Libya, whether it will remain unified or whether Cyrenaica and Tripoli will divide. Syria, the move towards peace talks on Syria between the Assad government and rebel-held regions could lead to a partition of Syria. One of the reasons that the rebels do not want to go to Geneva II today is because that would be the likely outcome, is them recognizing that Assad is in half the country. And that doesn't necessarily mean that Syria divides in two forever, but it does lead to it does lead to some sort of partition. And there are religious lines along which that gets partitioned, in the sense that the Alawites are maintaining power in the south and rebels, Islamists in the north. And the ISIS, Al-Qaeda, wants to unify Iraq and the Sunni parts of Iraq with Sunni parts with Syria. And so there are a lot of forces on the ground, and you know, America may not step in and prevent this sort of thing if it moves forward. So we don't know how this is going to turn out in the end.
Okay, Andy, jump in, because
Peter, can I just interject?
Go ahead, Charlie. This is CrossTalk. Jump in. Charlie asked to jump in. Go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead, Charlie.
I think that Libya is an unknown, but as far as Syria is concerned, one has to also look at Russia's involvement in all of this. It behooves Russia for Syria to stay how it is. That's essentially their only real interest right now in the Middle East. I think the Russians would like to see Assad staying in power, and I think they'd like to see the status quo.
We've gone over this ground before, Charlie. We've gone over this ground before. Russia's primary interest is to see Syria stay together as a sovereign state, because if Syria falls and Al-Qaeda takes over, it's a 20-hour drive to southern Russia. That's Russia's foreign policy, fundamental interest, and recognizing international law. We've been through this before. Andy, you want to jump in before we go to the break?
Well, yes, I think you misunderstood what Charlie said, because he said the same thing, that the Russians have an interest in a unified Syria. And you see, once you start breaking it up, you don't know what you'll end up with. You know, the Joe Biden wanted to divide Iraq into 3 parts, and that was ridiculed then and now. I was an opponent of the Iraq invasion, but nevertheless spent a lot. Yes, I spent a lot of time in Iraq in 2003 living there, and I saw the facts on the ground. But you're negating the issue of politics and power. However odious the Maliki regime may be, it does control the borders. It does have the attributes of a nation state. And I think the Kurds are rather shrewd in that they are profiting from the weakness of the Iraqi government, but at the same time, they don't want to take on the opprobrium of the organized world by unilaterally declaring independence. The last place to declare independence unilaterally, I think, was Rhodesia, and that got them nowhere. They ended up losing everything. So what we have here is that politics tends to be a binding influence and a binding force.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the making of the modern Middle East. Stay with RT. Welcome back to CrossTalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing the origins of the modern Middle East. Okay, Joshua, I'd like to go back to you in Norman, Oklahoma. The Western powers drew these borders in the Middle East as we know it today. They came up with a plan before the end of the war, and it was put into place after the war. How much can the Western powers, and particularly the United States in this case, control political change on the ground? I mean, we created this world when it comes to borders and move people on this side of the line, on that side of the line. We can have disagreements on this program, but it seems to me untenable. People are going to want to live among themselves. If we have dictators that are taking cues from other countries, particularly the Western countries, as we saw in North Africa and all through the Arab Middle East, it's just not working anymore. So can they continue to do it, or is there a new strategy?
Well, I think you're right, and this has big policy implications. There are 2 different issues. One is changing borders, and I agree with the other 2 guests that it's hard to change borders in this day and age, not impossible. But it's more importantly is the identity of the nation states. The colonial powers drew circles around geographic, regions, and they trapped people together who did not want to live together or found it difficult to live together. We've seen this in Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, and Syria. And multi-ethnic, multi-religious, and they've been in civil war rearranging the power. And that has led to ethnic cleansing and changing in balance of power, who's on top, who's on bottom. And that is a very dynamic process. We've seen it in Eastern Europe, cost of millions of people. We're seeing it today. And it means the policy implications are the United States or any major power cannot adjudicate these deep issues of national identity. In Iraq, we put the Shiites on top, Sunnis on the bottom, and it's still a civil war today. The Sunnis have been marginalized, and they're fighting tooth and nail, joining al-Qaeda. In Syria, Alawites have been on top for 50 years, and now the Sunnis want to get on top. And America is trying to adjudicate, but it will not be able to solve the deep-set, sectarian questions. Same in Lebanon, where you have a balance of power between different religious groups.
I don't think America is trying to adjudicate anything in Syria.
Okay, go ahead, Andy. Go ahead.
Well, they aren't. They did try to do it. They failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they learned their lesson.
Go ahead, Andy, in New York. Go ahead.
What Barack Obama has been criticized by the right wing for, and I think unfairly, is he's not doing anything in Syria. And his view has been the situation is not clear enough for us to have a national interest in this, what is essentially a civil war. But coming back to Libya, on the one side of Libya you have Algeria, and on the other side you have Egypt. Neither of those countries is going to attempt to absorb Libya. So the nation state of Libya will continue in its form. There will be fighting internally among the various tribes and factions, But none of those factions is sufficiently strong to create a nation state in place of the existing one.
Yes, but do you know what? But they have enough
Syria,
power.
yes,
they have enough power to create.
of
They have enough power to create a failed state, don't they, Andy? And that's what we're facing: a failed state. In Iraq, a failed state. In Afghanistan, a failed state.
They're all failed states.
Syria,
They're all
Syria,
failed
a failed state.
as
Okay,
Iraq.
that's what I'm getting at here. Charlie, you want to jump in? Go ahead.
I'd say Syria is a failed state. But can we also point out that you can't put all the blame on America? You know, let's not forget it's the people on the ground that are creating these failed states. Some of it, now I would disagree with things Andy was talking about as far as Syria is concerned. The problem with Obama was he didn't engage early enough. And obviously, the longer it takes to engage, the harder it is and the harder the choices. And eventually, you do have to engage. And that's the problem. If Mr. Obama had engaged himself about 3 years ago, before al-Qaeda got into, when there was a political vacuum, I think we'd have had a far better outcome than we have today. But yes, you're right. Nation building is not an easy process.
That's completely wrong.
And I think as far as Japan and Germany, about the last two times I can think of it having worked.
Okay, Joshua, jump in, because you know if I go to Joshua right now,
because
you know,
we
look at
hang
on, Joshua, hang on. It's what the U.S. should do, what the West should do. They've already done enough, don't you think? Okay, I think this is the problem. This is this Orientalist point of view that we must go and rearrange things again for the sake of the people on the ground when we didn't do it right in the first place. Joshua.
Well, those who argue that if we'd gone in quickly, we could have stopped radicalization, I think are completely wrong, and they're misreading the real roots of the problem. In Iraq, we went in and got rid of Saddam Hussein in 3 short weeks, and then things radicalized. The Sunnis, who are being thrown from the top of society down to the bottom, became radicalized, joined al-Qaeda, and we faced a major radicalized insurgency because we went in and tried to rearrange. If we had gone into Syria and tried to put in the moderates, we would have gotten a big al-Qaeda backlash. Things would have radicalized, and we've been in the same Iraq position. We have done this over and over again, thinking that we can go in and shape. These are deep national problems. What kind of Islam do we want? Who's going to be on top?
But at the same time,
Can I wave the U.S. flag?
Go ahead, all right, let's go to Andy. Andy in New York, jump in. Go ahead, Andy.
All right, I want to make 2 points. First of all, don't blame the United States for the modern Middle East. We had nothing to do with it. The Middle East was carved up by the French and the British empires. The United States had no role in determining the borders of how the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, well, they're saying the U.S. has some duty or the Orientalism. Now, let's look at Iraq again. First of all, Kurdistan is not going to declare its independence. Secondly, after the Iraqis kicked the United States out, the Shiites, the Maliki regime, they found that on their own they really couldn't operate their country. And now, a couple of weeks ago, Maliki was in Washington asking for help. I think the United States should always take a very restrained attitude towards intervening in these countries, but we should be there to help. And the fact of the matter was, even the Shiites realized they couldn't do it on their own, and they asked for us to bring some influence back into the process. That's a positive, and it's a healthy development, because it shows in trying to develop a democracy.
Okay, so
they have the same
if I go to Charlie, the U.S. needs to reinvade Iraq to fix things. Okay, Charlie, go ahead.
No, I wouldn't say we need to reinvade Iraq. That's facetious on its face. But I think we do need to take a lead role in the world, as we have done, promoting democracy and trying to promote freedom. It's not an easy job, especially when you do have these sectarian divides and religious divides. As I think Joshua just said, this was carved up by the British and the French, and it's the Arab world. It's not an easy place. But that said, that you don't ignore these places. I think that you look back at, for instance, Kuwait. Well, many a times the U.S. has stepped in trying to prevent the slaughter of Arab Muslims by other Arab Muslims, and I think that's a very important role that should continue.
Yeah, but Saddam was an American ally. Joshua, we keep mentioning history here, and this is the point of the program here. Hang on, let me go to Joshua. I want to talk about the history from the Second World War to the present. We know that during the peace negotiations after the First World War, that there were Arab leaders that went to the United States, appealed to Woodrow Wilson to help create an Arab United States. But of course, the British and the French got ahead of them, okay? Joshua, this is a huge question, but pull out your crystal ball and look into it, peer into it. Do you think they could have had something like an Arab United States in the Middle East as a legacy of the Ottoman Empire?
You know, obviously, Arab nationalism from one end of the Middle East to the other was the desire on the part of Nasser and the Ba'ath Party. Many Arabs proposed this, like the greater German desire, the greater Slavic desire, all these romantic 19th century and 20th century nationalist movements. It didn't happen in part because the Arabs were way too weak. You look at the Turks. Ataturk put together a big army that kicked out the foreigners. Faisal, the Arabs, could only put together a few hundred men in Damascus to face the French who came over from Lebanon and just devastated them within minutes. So the Arabs were not, the national cohesion was not there. And we're seeing that again in Syria, we're seeing that in Iraq. We're seeing that the fragmentation of these movements, these rebel movements, are leading to the breakup rather than the unification of the Arab world.
Okay. Andy,
you
want to
get Palestine for
go ahead, Charlie, jump in. Charlie, jump in.
The nations.
Hold it,
Palestine never meant a two-state solution. It's a three-state solution. You can't get Hamas and Fatah to work together, and that's the nub of the problem. Until these two groups are ready to settle their differences, who is Abbas representing at the table? He doesn't have the people of Gaza with him. So and that's just a microcosm.
Okay. Andy, do you want to jump in there? I mean, because
Well,
I mean,
let me.
Go
Having
ahead.
said
Go ahead. Jump in.
I do. Having said there'll be no change. Let me say how a change could take place unexpectedly. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very bellicose about it, starting a war with Iran, and it looks like he's increasingly isolated in that point of view. If Israel were to launch an attack on Iran, that could be a game changer. But my view of it, I write a column called Contrarian Commentary, which is to say, look at the other point of view. And all of Netanyahu's breastbeating, in my opinion, is a sign of weakness. He's raising the decibels as he realizes how weak Israel's position is. And the start of a war would probably boomerang on the Israelis. So if even the Israelis, who have nuclear weapons and the best military in the region, can't exercise any real power over their neighbors, it's facetious to think the Russians or the Americans or the Chinese. What's happening in the world as a whole is that culture is becoming the dominant influence. The Western culture, freedom, media. You have, for example, Al Arabiya, Al Jazeera. When I saw them working in Iraq in 2003, I said, this is not going to be your grandfather's Middle East, because people have access to information. And that's what's going to be the game changer.
All right, I want to jump in here. I want to go to Joshua. Give last word, 20 seconds, Joshua. What's the future here? More fragmentation?
Well, I wish
it's going to get worse and better. Go ahead.
I think that things are going to get a lot worse before they get better, and I don't think this is about freedom. I think there is a great desire for freedom, but the spreadsheet for most Arab countries looks very dark. Big youth bulge, not enough economic growth. There is going to be a lot of fighting, and I think that there will be ethnic cleansing, in parts rearranging of populations. If the borders can't change, then the people inside those borders are going to change.
All right, gentlemen, I have to jump in here. Fascinating discussion, but we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in Norman, New York, and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time, and remember, CrossTalk rules.
I love you.